I originally thought I would focus on my Uncle Bob's involvement in Stevenson Son, commonly called S&S, from his entry into the family business in around 1884 until the flotation of Moygashel Limited in 1950. I would mention rugby, the UVF, his army service and his family. I soon realised that the man known locally as the Major had an effect on Dungannon, Northern Ireland, and indeed further afield. I rewrote my talk and renamed it The Pathfinder. I will still mention rugby, the UVF, his army service and his family, but there's also libel, gun running, celebrities and more. So, how did we get here? The Stevensons came from Ranfurly with the Stuarts at the tail end of the 16th century. This image shows Wroxham Castle, built by Sir Andrew Stuart in 1618 and destroyed in 1641. They settled in the parish of Tulliniskin, Minive, in the precinct of Mountjoy. The O'Neills were patrons of the domestic linen industry in Elizabethan times, and it really took root under the planters, encouraged by James I. Relevant to this story is that the finest linens were produced in what later became known as the Linen Triangle, which was bounded by Newry, Dungannon and Lisburn. Yarn from the Strabane area was typically woven in Cookstown and Dungannon. The first recorded family link with the industry is when James, Earl of Abercorn, Tyrone's member of the Linen Board, appointed a lapper for Dungannon in 1727 on the recommendation of James Stevenson. Lappers were in many ways the equivalent of modern weights and measures inspectors. In his will dated 1744, James mentions his only son William and his grandchildren, John, owner of the Rowan flax spinning mills, Simon, a flax merchant, and Robert. Robert and William registered a partnership for the manufacture of flax in 1759, my apologies. Before his retirement to New York, Ernie Finney and I had selected this document as the first, together with the first government contract dated 1805, and a selection of other documents, including minute books of the original golf club in Ranfurly Park, I think minutes of the cricket club, and all intended for community use, out of a treasure chest of Stevenson private papers stored in Georgia Street. They were destroyed by fire after an IRA bomb at the Roan Courier in 1970. However, it is stated elsewhere that by the late 18th century, the Dungannon market had a weekly turnover of brown linen of £1,500, more than 10 times greater than that of Cookstown. The area had become prosperous by the end of the 18th century, and the Stevensons were doing well. In the next generation, Robert Stevenson, 1801-1868, was a merchant and mill and kiln owner. His son Robert, 1838-1907, a grain merchant, bought a town house so he could educate his sons at the Royal School and entertain overseas customers, including New York buyers, and in 1867 bought the warehouse premises in Georgia Street. In 1875, Robert bought Bark Mill at Moygashel when its owner went bankrupt, changed its name to Moygashel Mills, and produced power loom weaving using a 50 horsepower water turbine. Linen weaving had moved rapidly from a small-scale domestic production to an industrial scale. The talk could frustratingly have been very different. As already described, the papers intended for community use went up in smoke, and a later attack on the Dungannon Football Club destroyed memorabilia, including international caps for both cricket and particularly rugby, which would have looked wonderful in the rebuilt club. Much worse, though, was the deliberate destruction of much Moygashel history following Curthell's takeover of this company in 1969. A chief executive ordered an ex-colleague to eradicate all traces of Stevenson involvement. A Moygashel stalwart who wants to remain anonymous, probably aided and abetted by George Hamill, a third-generation weaving manager, was ordered to incinerate a huge pile of records. He took a quick look, thought that burning the papers just couldn't be right, and hid what he considered were the most important items from the archive beneath a concrete stairway hidden under a few webs of fabric. The same stalwart phoned me many months later to warn me that the building was going to be demolished in a couple of days. I immediately, and without permission, went to size up the situation. I picked up a minute book dating back to the late 1860s, saw enough to convince me that the value of the archive, and made my escape. I phoned Prony's acquisitions director and told him that the Public Record Office must acquire these papers. I remembered a barrister correcting me during a briefing years earlier when I queried whether the possession was indeed 9/10 of the law. I got a very sharp reply: it wasn't. It was 99.99% recurring, he said. So on that basis, I promised Prony's acquisition director a letter giving Prony legal ownership of those records. And as a result, he promised a van the next morning. Fortunately, the Curthells had by then sold the fabric division to Lamont Holdings, whose chief executive was ex-British Lion Dick Milligan, an old friend. He promised a backup letter. We loaded 2.5 tons of paper in that white van, and the acquisition director later told me that it would be Prony's prize archive. Shortly after that pickup, I visited the same ex-colleague in a care home in this area to tell him the archive was now lodged with Prony, to which I got the reply, well, at least I was able personally to burn all the Stevenson private papers, which wasn't the very best of news. Can I say at this stage that Prony are only too happy to give access to those papers, which are listed there in summary. The remaining papers showed how a small North Irish company had grown into an international company in a lifetime. In particular, the acquisitions director was fascinated by S&S's adoption of modern continental flax production methods. The director's summary was that this unique archive was something the local community, and indeed Northern Ireland, should be very proud of. It showed what could be created. The archive also covered the post-war takeover of a small farmers' cooperative in Moira, which became the basis of Moy Park, and detailed an ambitious undertaking where many of the companies had failed. A highly successful marketing company, Hamilton Adams in the USA. This archive has now been catalogued and is now accessible at Prony's new Titanic Boulevard site. The story of Moygashel cannot now be airbrushed out of existence. The whole community should be proud of it, and I've no doubt that the Major, with the pride he had in his workforce, would wish no less. I hope other people will pick up the baton and conduct serious research into his history. Thank you for your patience. I will now start my talk on the Pathfinder. What I say is in all good faith, but I will be delighted if research shows up necessary corrections and additions. I will welcome comments or criticisms, so please get my contact details from the Ranfurly Centre. In the early 50s, I used to do a morning round of the dye house. One day, Joe Meldrum, a shift manager with a ready tongue, asked what I thought of yesterday's announcement of Prince Elizabeth's engagement to Prince Philip. When I replied, "Buy a ring, pop the question, and Bob's your uncle," Joe said, "For once I will give you a serious answer, Harry. Your problem is that Bob is your uncle, and he's over 80. The Major was the eldest male of my generation, and when he was 61 when I was born. His grandson Derek Bingham, who Val and I visited recently, and said he cannot be here tonight, said he felt more like a great-grandson who was too young to remember any family anecdotes. And indeed I challenged Bobby Mills a few minutes ago to please tell me, as I'm sure he knew much more about my uncle than I did, his comments afterwards. We must judge the Major by the standard and practices of his time. His response to the accusation of paternalism would be the same as that of many Victorian entrepreneurs, that he was responsible for the welfare of those in his charge. He could be accused of being autocratic, but I would argue that he acted on strong principle, with high moral courage and strict self-discipline. I joined S&S in September 1945 at the age of 18. I was called into the strategically situated office, where I had once played with the dictaphones and his wax cylinders, for a lecture. Honesty is the only policy, my uncle told me. Not even the cleverest man will cover up dishonesty forever. Later that morning, Jim Lee, my boss for my first year of apprenticeship, reinforced Bob Stevenson's ethos. "You start with my 100% trust. If you betray it, you will go down not to 80 or 50, but to 0%. No matter how hard you try, you will never attain 100% again." And later that week, I received a letter from my Uncle Jack, a considerable businessman in his own right in South Africa. I doubt if it arrived by chance. And that really was the whole letter. Can you read it? I would add, people who take the high moral ground, as we see with too many politicians, can experience pitfalls. And as you will hear later, but by and large, Bob Stevenson practiced what he preached. I've seen it claimed he played for the club at the age of 14. He served his apprenticeship in Lisburn Weaving Company, which was owned by a branch of the family, and only played for Dungannon in the Times Cup. The rest of the time he played for Lisburn. This 5'9" man of 12 stone 7 pounds received the first of 15 caps for Ireland, and in that 1887, his first cap, Ireland savoured its first ever victory over England. The family always claimed he would have won more caps, but for the need to rescue the business. He went on to captain Ireland in 1890, and when he was appointed captain of the Dungannon Football Club, triggering a revival in the club's fortunes, again in 1890, he became a selector of the Irish team in 1898-99 and president of the IRFU in 1912-13. During this time, he presented the now lost Stevenson Cup for a competition between the national schools of the Dungannon district, including those of the Christian Brothers. Sadly, the Union Place School proved much too good, and a one-sided competition killed interest, which was a huge disappointment to him. Bob Stevenson took control of S&S in his late teens, some say 18. His father, by then an alcoholic, had invested in too many dubious mining and railway companies and had run the company into the ground. It was indeed on the verge of bankruptcy. Bob locked his father up at home. I never heard his children say a good word about my grandfather, but they all adored their mother. Lita Ramage, his future wife, had somewhat similar parents, hence the Stevenson window donated to St Anne's Parish Church. The new boss cracked the whip to such an extent that the head weaver, Mary Ann O'Farrell, handed in her notice. In those days, she was taking such a serious step, she was never again likely to gain permanent employment. And just as serious of a S&S, they would get a reputation as bad employers. He asked that she be brought before him, and after a good scolding, he said, "You know, Mary Ann, a rolling stone gathers no moss." And Mary Ann said, "Aye, sir, and I don't get pitched on neither." There was a brief pause, laughter and a handshake. And Mary Ann O'Farrell was appointed from another generation to teach me to weave. I would now like to come to some of the other activities. The Major was a friend and disciple of Sir Edward Carson, who we met regularly in Ranfurly House. He signed the Covenant and became second in command to Lord Northland in the Tyrone Battalion of the Ulster Volunteer Force. Lord Northland is the aristocratic tall figure number 1. My Uncle Robert is 2. My father is 3. And Will Dixon, great uncle of Chris, I think I'm correct in saying, has all the looks of Dixon. I little doubt was another company commander. I don't know who the 4th one is. I know Bob Bingham, the headmaster of the Royal School, was a company commander, but whether it's him I know not. On Ulster Day, 28th of September 1912, tens of thousands of men queued at Belfast City Hall to sign the Covenant against the establishment of a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin, and in favour of continuing the union with Great Britain. There was no need to be a Protestant to sign the Covenant, by the way, and a few Catholics signed the Covenant, but women had to sign the parallel declaration. My uncle and his brothers had given their adored mother a 1908 Daimler for her birthday. This was pressed into service as part of the County Tyrone Motor Car Corps to run rifles from Larne to the armoury in Ranfurly House in April 1914. The first time cars had ever been used in a large-scale military operation. About 500 cars, half the cars in the province, crammed the roads, but the government was powerless to take any action after the Curragh incident the month before. The Major never wavered in his belief that Home Rule for Ireland would be an economic disaster, and he could have argued that the Free State did suffer a severe decline in its living standards. With the start of the Great War, the Home Rule Bill was shelved during hostilities. Bob Stevenson joined the Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers. He claimed that he held the record for being the oldest subaltern in the army at the age of 49. I wish I had asked why the eldest male volunteered from a reserved occupation. I can only imagine it. He considered his duty as the only unattached brother. He served in the 6th Battalion at Solva Bay on the Aegean coast of Gallipoli Peninsula, and in the Sprig reports in 1915, Captain Stevenson was wounded in the Dardanelles, Solva Bay. His diaries record that his wounds bothered him for the rest of his life, but as a third of the men died there, he was relatively lucky. As this letter shows, Captain Stevenson was part of the Salonaica force. It commemorates an act of bravery by another Dungannon soldier who was killed while helping the wounded after their order to retreat. That little girl mentioned was Betty Bingham, who I remember, aunt of Peter Atchison, who I see here tonight. He was then posted to the 4th Battalion, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and later to the Leinster Regiment. Details are sketchy. Some of the regimental papers had been destroyed in the London Blitz, and other relevant papers burned in the law courts in Dublin. In 1918, on Armistice Day, the 11th of November, of the 11th month, he met Lita Ramage, the woman he described as his jewel in the desert, at the old Al-Hatti Hotel. She was the author of a well-reviewed novel, Judith McNair, published in 1907. She had a coming-out ball at the White House during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, and later set off on what was supposed to be a grand tour, arriving in Glasgow days after the outbreak of war. She went to Paris in 1915, joined the Voluntary Aid Detachment, which provided front line first aid and nursing, and ended the war as secretary of the commandant of the women's internment camp at Al-Hayati. She wrote in her diary about her most interesting Irishman, who knows more about problems of a social and political nature than almost any man I've ever met. I am seeing a great many things through his very blue eyes. The Army list of December 1918 shows Bob Stevenson listed as a major. Officially the major at last. Before he returned home, he married Lita Ramage in London. In the spring of 1920, he was appointed as secretary to the Covenanters located in what I will label west of the Bann. As an aside, I'm ever more convinced that there was and is a decent, live and let live approach west of the Bann that we must cherish. In the immediate post-war period, when I was studying at Belfast Tech, I used to catch a lift in Sir Emerson Herdman's carriage on the mail train after the Tuesday sitting of the Stormont Senate. I used to sit in what had been Queen Victoria's coach, listening to Sir Emerson and my Uncle Bill, both Unionist senators, and the National Senators Joe Stewart and Jerry Lennon, discussing politics over a bottle of stout. Incidentally, the Herdmans had started a social experiment similar to Robert Owen's at New Lanark. They provided housing, school, recreational facilities, and churches for their workers, all in an integrated community of Protestant and Catholics. This is worth remembering when I discuss Moygashel's health provisions later. Sometimes live and let lives needs a little help. The Major sold the Stevenson town house to Frank Shields' family to ensure a Catholic professional was at last established in Northland Row, an act which didn't win universal acclaim. I want to summarize the appeal to the Ulster Council from the Covenanters, from Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan, the excluded counties of the 9-county province, and indeed the great and the good from all over Ulster, who had asked Bob Stevenson to act as their secretary. The 6-county entity was only one of several ideas for partition. 8, 6 and 4 options were suggested. 1. Signatories believed they had an honourable obligation to stand together to resist Home Rule. 2. Any decision about partition without widespread consultation would be profoundly undemocratic. The British House of Commons and its party leaders expected the leaders of the 6 counties to stand by their brethren in the 9 counties. The trade of Donegal is very much with Derry, and much economic inconvenience would be caused by placing it under a different and possibly hostile administration. I find it ironic that in private conversations with John Hume and indeed Austin Currie in the 1960s, they were making that point in very strong terms. 5. The Ulster representatives to the Irish Commission supported an amendment to exclude the 9 counties in the majority report. 6. The Ulster people have stood together for many generations, and their confidence in and reliance on each other has been the chief cause of their success and prosperity. He never forgave Craig, Lord Craigavon, and his ilk for leading a selfish push for a selfish solution of a small Protestant state in the northeast of Ireland. And he held that if there was a threat to follow Protestants, which he doubted, they should all stand or fall together. The Major would have stood as one with Sir Edward Carson, a still styled Irish Unionist, when he stated, "I will keep my covenant to the day of my death." I think the two opening paragraphs are important. He was a district commandant in the Ulster Special Constabulary, although once again, sadly, all the records are destroyed or not available. S&S was guarded every night to ward off IRA flying columns. A Hale Martin spinning mill on the Moygashel side of Armagh had been destroyed, and the family was keen to avoid a similar fate. Around this time, according to just one of the series of hair-raising family stories I distinctly remember, the Major was put against a wall in the bush and threatened with being shot, presumably to put the frighteners on him. Even if it's in confidence, I would love to hear more about this incident. After the Great War and partition, the Ulster branch of the Irish Rugby Union wanted to secede. There is, though, no mention of this in the Irish Rugby Football Union Council minutes of the 20s. Edmund Van Nesbitt, the then doyen of Irish rugby correspondence, told me when I visited the IRFU that the IRFU was never in danger of splitting with the spirit and stature of your uncle and Sam Lee, who just would not let it happen. The Major and Sam Lee were both council members. I was refused permission to inspect the Ulster branch's minutes, but at some stage there must have been a forgiveness, and the presentation of in 1962 of the Stevenson Shield, inscribed, "To commemorate with gratitude and respect the services of the late Major Robert Stevenson, DL, to the maintenance and advancement of rugby football in Ireland. This shield has been presented by the Dungannon Football Club to the Ulster branch of the Irish Rugby Football Union for the perpetual competition in the Senior League." In the great post-war boom, when virtually anything sold at any price, the Major decided that the linen industry was on its way to committing suicide. The Major's forward thinking about the linen industry had been in evidence during the run-up to war, but it was not universal. The Major likened the industry to a wartime convoy whose speed is governed by the slowest ship. S&S resigned from all the cartel trade bodies, the powerloom weavers, Irish dyers and finishers, etc., to a short-term detriment and considerable trade unpopularity. At the same time, he was planning for the future, following his mantra that one should invest during a recession and not follow the fashionable herd in over-investing in good times. As in any well-run company, he planned his succession, the boys. He also installed an apprenticeship scheme with day release to both Dungannon and Belfast technological colleges, and in 3 later cases, full-time release to universities. He described the boys, the team he brought on, to me after he retired. Ernie Finney, son of Lord Ranfurly's Landsteward, had a brilliant mind and a prodigious memory, possibly enhanced by a nature's compensation for impaired vision of a detached retina. Lacked the killer instinct, and to his credit, gave priority to caring for a very ill wife. Without his diplomatic negotiations with the boys over the terms of the flotation, it might never have succeeded. Lindsay Millington, was not the first good salesman to be over-promoted. The Major realized he was not to run the US marketing company, recalled him to London, and substituted Hamilton Adams, a decision that was totally vindicated until the question of the Major's succession came to a head. Jim Lee, son of Sam Lee, was highly innovative, but tended to cut corners and required constant supervision. The Major interviewed the 17-year-old Hamilton Adams at the request of his sister Dora. Hammy had only a primary school education and what sounds like a hygiene problem. When he turned up for his interview, the Major told him to return the next day with clean feet and socks, and said he would interview him. Hammy turned up thereafter every morning at the same time as the cleaners, opened, sorted and read the mail, and got to grips with every aspect of the business. He was moved to the Belfast office, where he attended night classes, and later to London under Lindsay Millington. He then, as I've just mentioned, set up the US marketing company. Hammy built up the business, took a US citizenship, and served with the US Army in Italy during World War II. Max Eitel was the son of a leading Swiss dye house owner and a graduate of the outstanding German University for Textile Chemistry. Max and Irene, the daughter of Robert Brown, and a good friend of the Major's, chairman of Brown and Adam and other leading textile companies, had decided to get married, which might have had a bearing on his coming to and joining S&S. Linen dyeing and finishing hadn't progressed much since biblical times. Fabric shrank and dyes ran. The Major realized that he had to revolutionize the process, and he hired Max in 1932 as an apprentice at a salary of £1,000 per annum, which is equal to some £57,000 per annum today. Max fully justified his recruitment by developing fast-dyed, penetrated fabric with shrink resistance and crease resistance process for linen and indeed other fibres. Max's father-in-law arranged for Tom Cahoon, the son of his dye house manager, to assist Max in putting these processes into operation. The Moygashel quality standard, established in 1935, was the revolutionary benchmark other manufacturers had to emulate. But these developments required considerable capital investment and were taking place against the background of the Great Depression. Incidentally, Max's technical revolution is to be found in Living Linen Index, as a transcribed oral history lodged at the Ulster Folk Museum. The previous year, the Major had assembled a workforce of some 200 to explain the serious state of business and offered them a choice of redundancy or a wage cut. A cut in the mail rate from 31 to 29 shillings per week was accepted without rancour, but it was reversed and followed by an increase in wages 2 years later. Lord Ranfurly, when departing Dungannon, gifted water rights to S&S, which was to be a total godsend in the days to come. Wilson Smith of Smith Weaving in Branbridge, later to become part of Moygashel Limited, backed the Major's plans, both in kind and money, and Bob Scott, the chairman of the Northern Bank, also backed him. The frame house was destroyed by fire at night in 1935, though the works manual fire engine and many locals set up a bucket chain and stopped the fire spreading to other buildings. Although S&S was a near pariah following its resignation from the trade bodies, the trade rallied round and saw S&S through a year while rebuilding and re-equipment took place. A sign of the hard times was that Hahn and Wolff were reduced to quoting for and winning the contract for the steel work. One of the Major's many talented friends, I'd love to know where and how he met them, was visiting a lower. But Frank Bunker Gilbreth was a US pioneer of time and motion studies, whose productivity recordings were still valid some 15 years later when I became involved. The story is told of his watching 14 men with wheelbarrows carting earth from a very restricted site with wheelbarrows. 13 men pushed theirs and one pulled his. After much thought, sensing a major discovery, Gilbreth was forced to ask the odd man out why he pulled his barrow. Without stopping or removing his pipe, he replied, "'Cause I'm tired of the sight of the effing thing sore." The Major initiated talks with Convoy Woolen Mills to add a complementary product to the portfolio for the new USA marketing project. This would help sell Irish linen for the summer season and Irish tweed for the winter. The banks and accountants had drawn up an agreement to which both parties agreed. My Uncle Jack came over from South Africa to join my father, Uncle Bill, and the Major for the formal signing. The other family laid into a well-stocked drink trolley and continued drinking over lunch. The Major did not drink during working hours, and when asked for a second helping of a sherry trifle, the host produced a slurred and oft-repeated family remark. "Is that the sort of a boy you are? You won't drink it out of a glass, but you'll slop it up with a spoon." The Major and his sober brothers got to their feet and walked out. The Major believed it was better to scrap the deal there and then, rather than suffer the inevitable disputes later on. Early in my career, I spent an educational week in the East End of London, in the low end of the rag trade. I was only entrusted to sell interlinings when I haggled over minuscule amounts. When I reported back, the Major asked if I'd opened any new accounts. I proudly gave the name. He asked my opinion of him. "He was without doubt the most objectionable man I have ever met," I replied. "Close the account and ever only conduct business with people or professionals you like. Otherwise you end up with disputes that involve wasted time and money that will take years to recover." I was given in retrospect another lesson on banks that is still relevant to this day. The Major advised me never to be seduced by the bankers' temples with their marble floors and mahogany counters, and to treat them as you would treat any other shop. The only difference was that they were retailing cash. After the annual review of an account, Bob Scott, the chairman of Northern Bank, asked me what I thought of the meeting. When I said I was surprised there were no cash flows or projections, I got a valuable slap down. A good banker backs the man, not predictions. Who am I to question how Bob Stevenson runs his business? He knows that much better than I do. If he has a problem, I trust him, knowing he will come and discuss it with me. The Major's high moral principles reached a Gilbertian peak in a libel case by Dungannon Urban Council, Dungannon Rural Council, and others, including your father, Tom, and the Tyrone Printing Company in the King Bench Division in Belfast on the 11th of June 1935. They objected to a letter published in the Tyrone Courier about a proposed new hospital. He pointed out that in it that there was not enough money to build and staff an extravagantly large hospital, that poorer people would be the main victims if, rather than the alternative, a smaller and affordable hospital were to be built. The larger the institution embarked upon, he said, the greater number of jobs for officialdom and more grist to the mill for the traders of the town. There was, he said, a vast difference of opinion between the ratepayers and the elected officials. And S&S was, by the way, the largest ratepayer. Despite repeated questions, he'd been unable to find out from officials how much the proposed new hospital would cost. A sworn inquiry, which makes fascinating reading, trotted out many of the current arguments on specialist care versus local treatment. Britain had been forced to come to the rescue of Newfoundland because of the straits which the Dominion had been reduced to by graft and speculation in high places, he wrote. Was it too late, he asked, for common sense to come to the rescue of our great local project? Speculation, by the way, was a typographic error introduced by the newspaper. The Major had written peculation, I suppose embezzlement. He was asked to withdraw the letter, but could see no reason to. He did not regard it as defamatory. The elected officials certainly did. In his summing up, Mr. Justice Brown said that all involved were honourable men, and he regretted that no sensible person had brought them together. He made 2 points, though. In the matter of public interest, everyone was entitled to express an opinion, and people in public office are bound to be criticised, but must be protected from illegal criticism. The jury could not reach agreement and was discharged. S&S had an arrangement with the Royal Victoria Hospital to treat their employees for more serious illness, and a doctor and a nurse to deal with their less serious problems locally, an early form of NHS. Most of the 400 workers in S&S signed a letter expressing their support when he replied on the 14th of June, immediately after the 4-day hearing. There are occasions in one's life when the appreciation and support of those around one are particularly welcome and strike home. May I thank you one and all for standing by me in my efforts to preserve honesty, truth, and courage in public life. If you do not realize, I do, the joy and privilege of leading where such confidence and loyalty abound. I thank you again. The Major had remarkable friends, some of whom I've mentioned. Madame Schiaparelli, regarded the equal to Coco Chanel in the interwar fashion, would visit her lower to pick new fabrics and colours based on leaves, seaweeds, or other themes. The lab quickly realised it was easier to dye samples and find the leaf that matched. The Major also told me about bringing Paul Robeson into our hotel, his nickname for the Dorchester, only to be told that Negroes were not allowed into the dining room. He took no notice and asked to be led to his table. He was no doubt in one of his Irish tweed suits. As I have said previously, linen technology in Ireland had not advanced in centuries, and flax processing was back-breaking and very labour-intensive. Another war was looming, and linen was still a strategic material in a pre-nylon period. If the UK was cut off from a flax supply, parachute harness, aircraft linen, hosepipes, and many other products would run out. Much flax at that time came from Flanders, the centre of modern flax processing industry. Queen's University supervised the growing and testing of 3 varieties of modern flaxseed at a small 1/4-acre site inside the works in 1938. By the next year, 3 acres were under cultivation, and by the time France fell, there was enough seed for commercial planting. At the time of Dunkirk, the latest flax processing equipment with top priority was brought out at the last gasps through Cherbourg. James Mackey measured it on site at Moygashel and put it into immediate production. The shipment includes a flax pulling machine, a de-seeder, an automated scutching machine, and for line yarn, chemically controlled retting tanks and flax dryers. Earl Delaware, a minister in Churchill's cabinet, was appointed chairman of the Imperial Flax Commission, with Ernie Finney as his vice chairman. Max Eitel, with his technical qualifications, was a member of the commission. J.E. was responsible for a wartime revival of flax not only in Northern Ireland, but also in traditional growing areas, such as Norfolk and Somerset. S&S were responsible for their growing and processing of some 20,000 acres of flax during the war, with the help of many local farmers. When the war ended, flax growing was no longer viable. However, a skilled and dedicated staff was able to start farming Ranfurly Park, which the Major had bought towards the end of the war. This led to factory farming, the purchase of a farmers' cooperative in Moira, and the creation of Moy Park. Charles Butler, a Nottingham garment manufacturer, came to Moygashel after his premises were blitzed. This was the start of the fashion line, given the maiden name of my Aunt Lita. Plus to follow, Strelitz and Stegen, respectively women's and men's wear tailoring. The two Stringer brothers of Edward VII's tailor brought refinement to the tailor, and the Major always wore a Stringer suit. Death duties were crippling in the late 40s, and to save 4,000 jobs plus, it became essential to float the Moygashel production group. J.E. was an honest broker between the family and the boys. J.E. had the ability, but not the will to take over after Hamilton Adams. Hamilton Adams had the will and the ability, but would not return. Moygashel was floated in 1950, and that ended S&S Limited and the Stevenson influence. So what went wrong later on? The Northern Ireland linen industry was in decline, but I would say that Moygashel was much more than just part of the Irish linen industry. The Major and his brothers were in declining health and had lost their fight to have the recently retired Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar appointed chairman. The family was worried that a weak and complacent leadership under the boys would lead inevitably to disaster, a prophecy that sadly came true. I have no doubt that with the company's talented, well-trained and dedicated workforce, Templar would have led the company through the huge and necessary changes, and key parts of the business would have prospered. I believe Moygashel Limited might have avoided the Curtall's takeover. After a period of drift, Alan Field, a Curtall's director and company doctor, was appointed chairman of Moygashel in the late 60s. I was appointed to listen and add explanation while he carried out an inquest to ascertain what had gone wrong in the fabric division as a preliminary step to understand what actions were necessary to mount a successful rescue. I spent some of the most painful days of my life witnessing the humbling of men who I'd, by and large, greatly respected. I resigned from Curtall's a short time later for another reason. J.E., by then long retired and living in the USA, wrote to express his delight. He fully understood the dilemma that I had been facing, and he added that the Major would have been pleased that the name Stevenson had been removed and would not be further tainted. Finally, I wish to record what I would call the Major's benevolence, again based on strict principles. Any money he or the company gave should never exceed 50% of the total required, so to leave the ownership and responsibility with the recipient. He also believed it was immoral to claim tax relief on any charity giving. Why, he would ask, would his gift of a certain amount be worth more than the non-tax-paying widow's mite? The rough details of the Moygashel church hall are clear in my memory. The then rector required a church hall. The major wanted a community hall with possibly a folding partition to close off a consecrated area for worship, and promised a cheque of £1,000, some £25,000 today, if this condition was met. The rector insisted that it must be a church hall, regardless of the generation of the conditional £1,000 offer, just under half the amount needed to pay off the debt. Lisa Stevenson opened the church hall with the dispute not settled. She put an envelope into the plate, which when opened contained a cheque for £999, 19 and 11 pence. I am sure that the Major is delighted to know that St. Elizabeth Church is flourishing, along with its adjacent parochial hall. I will pick out one other act known to older Moygashel residents. When Hitler overran Czechoslovakia, the Major brought to Northern Ireland the wife, son and daughter of SNS's Jewish agent, who was later to die in a concentration camp, and helped them with their accommodation and education. Maybe I complicate matters too much. My Aunt Lita quotes the Major in a letter to her sister. The only real value of money was what one could do with it for other people. I will finish this with my last conversation with my uncle. As I was getting ready to leave, after a wonderfully, totally clear conversation, I asked a rather imprecise question. What was the most important event in his life? For the first time in my life, I heard from his own lips the Mary Ann O'Farrell's reply to his telling her that Rolling Stones gathering no moss, and it don't get pitched on neither sort, and its lasting effect on his life. I then asked a precise question. What did he consider was his greatest achievement? Without hesitation, he stated, preventing the partition of Irish rugby after the war. I attended the funeral the next week. And I will leave you with words from the IRFU's obituary, one of many to be published. Truly a great man, and one whose memory the Union will venerate. Thank you.
One of my first exercise in the morning was to walk out to the Black Rock and measure the depth of the water. Walk out to the Black Rock and to see and get the depth there, and you know, an inch of water in the Black Rock was quite a lot, and to get that in the more or less the tenth of an inch or whatever it was, and the mark on the stick. And that was my first job. Stevenson Son.
This quarry where all the granite stone, I presume it's granite, to build the walls, which I presume were built during the famine period, was very deep. And when we got an attack of algae, due to the farmers putting probably too much fertilizer on the fields and it washed down in, we actually diverted all the water that flowed through there, put in, I think, half a part per million of chlorine, which killed the green slime, and it sank to the bottom of that pit. And but otherwise, without that quarry, I think Moygashel would have had to close due to the amount of algae coming down in the water.
Do you realise how it permeated every aspect of Dungannon society? Stevenson's, I mean, I don't think there was one of us that wouldn't have had a Moygashel t-shirt, or whose father hadn't worn a pale linen jacket from the factory shop in the summer, or whose sofa wasn't covered with one of those chintzy things with a wee castle in the back. There's that material seemed to pop up in everybody's house in Dungannon. I think they gave people employment. It gave a sense of producing something which was valuable. The artistic talent that came to Dungannon, I think of Derek Hume as one name that sticks in my head. We had exciting, vibrant people that came to Dungannon who wouldn't have been in darkest Tyrone if it wasn't for Moygashel and everything that it produced. And I think having something that people can call their own and be proud of was very, very important in that era. Although I was only sort of like a child, sort of catching on the tail end of these things, but it's been wonderful to hear what you have said about where the origins came from, and bits and pieces of what my father would have said in the past, and put the whole picture together.
In a small community, all right, it spreads outside Dungannon, but 2,500 people were employed in the Dungannon area at its peak, out of the sort of 4,500 as a total peak. And I believe there was something at one time like 26 buses driving away from Moygashel of an evening, all basically full of people as far up as Capan Pomeroy and certainly to Moy and Caledon. So it was a terrible disaster when it closed, and I think that was what J.E. Finney's letter to me in America expressed very clearly.